In our previous lecture, we examined the Epic of Gilgamesh, and we looked at its first half from the telling of the story of the kingship of Gilgamesh and his tyranny to his meeting with Enkidu and to Enkidu's death. In this lecture, we will look at the second half, and we will review some themes common to both halves. In the second half of the narrative, and let me give you an overview of what happens first, Gilgamesh, inconsolable after the death of Enkidu, memorializes his fallen companion. And he does this in a number of ways. He builds statues memorializing him. He writes poetry. He tries every way he can to evoke the memory of his fallen friend. We read that grief was in his innermost being. This is what's said about Gilgamesh. And he roamed the earth, seeking the secret of eternal life, because now the question of death has finally come to him. We read that as a king, Gilgamesh never thought of death, but now that his best friend has died, he thinks of death. And after many trials and adventures, Gilgamesh reaches the abode of one man named Utnapishtim, the one man who survived the great flood and who gained immortality. Utnapishtim and his wife were granted this immortality, but it becomes clear to Gilgamesh that no one else can get this. It's a process in which he learns this. But Gilgamesh still is undeterred. He makes one last grab at immortality, which fails, of course, and chastened and hopefully wiser, he returns to his city. Now, in the first part, in the part in which Gilgamesh and Enkidu meet, we see a number of themes evoked. Of course, the very powerful theme of companionship, of friendship, of the person without whom you don't want to go on living. We saw the ability of friendship to modify behavior, how both of these people changed. And we saw the very interesting part that ideas of sexuality played in the minds of the narrator. The fact that Gilgamesh is a kind of sexual tyrant. He insists on sleeping with the brides of the town. And the fact that Enkidu becomes, quote, civilized, fit for urban life through his sleeping with a prostitute. Very odd for modern sensibility, or perhaps so modern we can't imagine that it's so ancient. Now, these themes will be reinforced, and others will enter the story as we go along. Enkidu dies, but he doesn't disappear completely from the narrative. He moves to a netherworld we described briefly in the first part of our lecture on this topic. Gilgamesh waits a week after Enkidu's death. He realizes that he's not coming back. He's completely dead. He keeps hoping, will his friend awaken? Maybe he's suspended. He will come back to life. But once Enkidu has been dead for a week, Gilgamesh performs the funeral rites of the city. And then, consumed by grief, he declares that all day and night I have wept over him and would not have him buried, as if my friend might yet rise up again at my loud cries. At this point, Gilgamesh embarks on a journey, the journey to the man Utnapishtim, for he has heard of one man who's escaped death and achieved immortality. And Gilgamesh wants to learn what his, quote, secret is. And Gilgamesh, goes through a whole series of adventures, meeting fabulous creatures and kind of guardians of the land of the dead. And, as in all great epics, because the epic must go on, he does succeed in getting past these guardians. And he's finally led across the waters of death to the island of Utnapishtim. And he has a guide, the boatman Urshanabi. We could think of Virgil taking Dante through hell in Dante's Inferno. The idea that a guide, a transitional figure, is necessary to take you through the realm of the dead. The poem tells us that, as they approached the island, Utnapishtim stood on the other shore, his old and rugged features worn by the seas and deserts he himself had crossed. He wondered why the sacred stones had been destroyed, why the boat was only drifting, and who the man was who resembled loss itself. That is, Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh now resembled loss itself. Before the ship had touched his shore, he thought, I am afraid that nothing here can help him. Gilgamesh can't be helped. Utnapishtim and Gilgamesh meet, and then a very touching thing happens. Utnapishtim raised his hand and touched the shoulder of the younger man to put him at ease. Two things encourage me to hope, he said, that one can come this far to bring life to a friend, and that you understand how we must borrow light from the blind. My own right eye was damaged long ago, and my left is slowly decaying. So Utnapishtim is saying that he himself can't really lead him. He himself is blind in a sense, but he recognizes that Gilgamesh has come not simply to seek immortality, but to seek a way to get Enkidu back. This is not an abstract search on Gilgamesh's part. It's not a philosophical quest. It's an actual quest, which is what makes it such a great story. He literally wants to go down to hell and get this person back. And he wants to know the secret of how he can do it. And Utnapishtim continues in this vein of recognizing friendship. Friendship is vowing toward immortality and does not know the passing away of beauty. This is a theme that will come up again later in the poem, that friendship and other relationships can be a substitute for eternal life. Family members can be a substitute. That someone lives on alleviates the pain of loss. It's at this point that Gilgamesh looked into the face of the older man, in whom he saw loneliness. He could still feel the touch of Utnapishtim's hand. And now we get a description of a very beautiful, suspended, intimate moment in which Gilgamesh and the immortal man Utnapishtim commune in a very quiet, beautiful setting. Time and space were uneventful now. Nothing inclined him to impatience. They talked together, walked and sat on rocks. The older man seemed pleased to have his company, as if an absent son or other loss had been slightly returned to him. In time, the younger felt he knew him well enough to say, "You sometimes seem to have a downcast look, as if the life you have found here still has failed to bring you peace. How did you come to find this world and reach this life?" So already at this early point of the encounter between the young man searching for immortality and the old man who has it, the young man recognizes that the old man experiences loss even though he's immortal. So perhaps immortality isn't what it's made out to be. Right? Perhaps there's something missing even if you live forever. Utnapishtim embarks on his own tale, saying, "I did not come out of desire like you," said Utnapishtim. "I was the choice of others." And it's at this point that the poem goes into a long description of Utnapishtim's story, how the gods warn him of a flood. Actually, the gods discuss a flood, and one god, Eo or Enki, warns Utnapishtim. And Utnapishtim, together with his wife, and together with animals and with artisans, survive on the ark. The flood lasts a week. All living things are destroyed, except for the creatures on the ark. Gilgamesh hears from Utnapishtim that this cannot happen again, and the fact that he, Utnapishtim, was granted immortality was a one-time occurrence. Now, the week's duration of the flood becomes a literary device in our tale, because Gilgamesh says now that he himself can stay awake as long as the flood, and he can conquer death. Because if you can conquer sleep, you can conquer death. Of course, it's an idea that many young people seem to have, that they can conquer sleep. I can say as a college teacher, And as the parent of a college student, there seems to be this idea that you don't have to sleep, right? And a charming thing happens here where the old man and his wife, Utnapishtim and his wife, prove to Gilgamesh that his quest for immortality, even at this level of the quest to conquer sleep, is foolhardy. Utnapishtim's wife, who is not named, as often in these epics, it's the wife of, she said to her husband, "Touch him again and wake him," because the young man had fallen asleep, "so he can return in peace to his home." She had learned to read her husband's moods. "Men are deceitful and incapable of peace, I know," he said. "Can't he even stay awake with me? Sleep is like death, only slothful people yearn for." And here comes the very charming trick and literary device. This is what Utnapishtim tells his wife. "Bake loaves," he ordered her, "and put them at his head, one for each day that he sleeps. We'll see how long it is before he wakes." Over her frail protest, the trial was set. After some days, Utnapishtim woke the younger man who thought he had barely gone to sleep. We've all had this experience waking a young person. "Oh, I've only been asleep for 5 minutes. You know, they've been asleep for 24 hours. And this is what they say. "You have slept for 7 days, he said. Look at the dried out loaves my wife has baked. How will you bear eternal life? It is not easy to live like the gods." Again, the theme, even if you gain immortality, you really haven't gained anything. Now, at this point in the story, and again, thinking from a literary standpoint, well, the listeners expect resolution. Well, this might be resolution. Gilgamesh realizes not only can't he gain immortality, not only was Utnapishtim the only man to be granted immortality, but he can't even stay awake for more than a few days at a time. Might as well go home. No. He seems to be fully convinced that he can't gain it, but not completely. There's a deep strain of stubbornness operating here. Of course, he's a combination of the human and the divine, so he's going to try for immortality. He's disappointed at the message, and he's about to cross back across the waters of death and return. But Utnapishtim, as a last parting gesture and as if to tantalize him, gives him a gift. He tells him about something. He says there's a plant that grows at the bottom of the sea in this area. The name of the plant is "The Old One Becomes a Child." That's the name of the plant. If you use this plant, you will not grow old. It will renew you continually. And Gilgamesh finds the plant and is going to use it when he goes back to Uruk. So notice what the story is doing here. He can't get the idea of immortality. He can't even get the idea of staying awake. There's no concept, there's no secret, but there's a thing. Well, a modern counterpart might be, well, give me a pill, right? If you can't solve my problem, give me a pill. So he says, well, there's a pill. If you search for it, you can get it. So he gets the pill. The pill is in the form of a plant, and he's going to carry it back to Uruk. But he stops at one point at a pool to bathe because he's very grimy from his journey. He's traveling with Urshanabi, the boatman. And the plant falls into the water, and a snake slithers along and steals the plant. This, of course, explains, doesn't it, why snakes can renew their skin, because they found the plant that Gilgamesh had. So, incidental to this wonderful quest for immortality, we get an ideological tale of why snakes renew their skin. Well, Gilgamesh knows that he can neither get the cure or the pill. He has to go back to Uruk. And accompanied by the boatman, Urshanabi, he makes his way back home. He has finally accepted that the quest for immortality is in vain. "I shall give up," he tells his new companion, the boatman. As they near the city, Gilgamesh admires its walls, its terraces, its brickwork, all of which he has built. His pride in the city and in the civilization which it houses is a sign of his acceptance of mortality. For the city will live on after him. The walls of the city will stay there. The walls of the city, which we are told in the beginning of the poem, Gilgamesh himself constructed, will be a testament for him. Well, here we have an idea we're familiar with from many traditions, that if you yourself can't survive, something that you build, something that you accomplish, will survive. If you yourself can't survive, your children will survive. Your works will survive. This is the answer to the quest for immortality. So they are nearing the city of Uruk, Gilgamesh and his companion Ur-Shanabi. Let us return to the poem. At 20 leagues, they stopped only to eat. That is 20 leagues from the city. At 30 leagues, they stopped to rest for the night. And so they traveled until they reached Uruk. There, Gilgamesh the king said to the boatman, "Study the brickwork, study the fortification, climb the great ancient staircase to the terrace, study how it is made. From the terrace, see the planted and fallow fields, the ponds, the orchards. 1 league is the inner city, another league is orchards, still another the fields beyond. Over there is the precinct of the temple, 3 leagues and the temple precinct of Ishtar. Measure Uruk, the city of Gilgamesh." And this section concludes saying, "From a far journey he returned. He was weary but at peace." So we have the notion here that the quest failed, the hero returned and achieved a certain kind of equilibrium. He comes to a realization, he's at peace. Notice, in the conclusion of this part of the poem, we have references to the realia of the Sumerian world and of the later city-states. That is, there is brickwork, there are fortifications, there are terraces and fields, ponds and orchards. Now, what is all of this about? It's not only a description of brickworks, it's about the concept of the city-state, which I spoke about in the first few lectures. The idea that in order to have a city, you must have land producing food. You must have a population that works the land. You have to have a surplus of food. And you have to have administration that brings that food to the city. You have to have a system. So Gilgamesh is celebrating not only the physical reality of the city, he's celebrating the system that he as the administrator makes possible. There are orchards, there are fields. I mentioned in an earlier lecture that in every one of these city-states there was a temple and a palace. Here he notes the precinct of the temple and the temple precinct of Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, a goddess we've encountered many times in our talks. So among the literary and philosophical implications of the tale up to this point are the idea of acceptance, the idea of world weariness, and the idea of being weary but at peace. Now, this might seem a fitting end to the Epic of Gilgamesh. We had the story of the 2 companions. We have the story of their battles, of the loss of one of them, the tragic loss of Enkidu, who is wounded, his wound festers, he dies, and it's through his death that King Gilgamesh realizes that there is death. That is, he's never really confronted this before. And then, in today's lecture, as we embarked on the second part, we saw how Gilgamesh's quest to Utnapishtim led him to a certain wisdom. Utnapishtim tells him that he himself and his wife survived the flood. No one else can survive it. Utnapishtim himself is lonely. This is what Gilgamesh sees. So perhaps immortality is not something to be striven for. Well, all these are wise lessons. And as we come to the end of the section we just read, Gilgamesh and Urshanabi return to their city. They praise the city. The city is seen as a way for the king to immortalize himself. Now, this, in a sense, brings us to the end of the epic, but a final tablet was found. And this tablet does not take the story on in terms of the narrative of the humans, but rather it brings us back into the realm of the interaction between the human and the divine. Because towards the end of the story, as we have it now, we have human beings going back to their town and making their peace with their own lives and their own deaths. This final tablet incorporates earlier Sumerian poems into the Babylonian cycle, and it returns us to this theme of inconsolable loss. In this text, Gilgamesh invokes magic to bring Enkidu back from the underworld. You'll recall my saying that the quest here is not simply one for immortality, it's one for actually bringing back the deceased. And in recognition of the centrality of that idea, we have a further text which brings us into the netherworld, or the underworld. Gilgamesh succeeds in bringing Enkidu back, but Enkidu cannot return to the real world of the living, for he is now a fixture of the world of the dead. He tells Gilgamesh of this shadowy world, the world of the irretrievably dead. And some scholars have called this an appendix, although, of course, it doesn't say that, right? It's another tablet about Gilgamesh found in a number of recensions. But it is a sort of an appendix, and it adds a more somber, less optimistic, but yet still life-affirming tone to the conclusion of the tale. So let us hear sections of this final tablet. One night in his loneliness, Gilgamesh pleaded with Ea to open the door of death and let the spirit of Enkidu return to him for a moment. You'll recall that Ea, the Sumerian name is Enki, that Ea is the god who interacts with humans, who helps humans. And in a reference to something within this same set of tablets, Ea, Enki, is the god who warned Utnapishtim of the flood. So now Gilgamesh is turning to this god, and he asks him to open the door of death and let the spirit of Enkidu return for a moment, only for a moment. For a moment, by Ea's grace, the two friends met and almost touched. Gilgamesh could not hold back his tears and begged him to come near. And now Enkidu speaks from the dead. "You have wept enough for me," Enkidu said. "A friend is not allowed to add to grief. I have grown weak, devoured in my flesh. You must not try to touch me." "I need to see you are the same," cried Gilgamesh. "I am afraid that you will hate the friendship we have known because it did not last forever." Gilgamesh, not listening, reached out to the image of his friend, trying to see what Ea veiled. "If you're my friend," Enkidu said, "you must not touch me. Treat me as Utnapishtim treated you." Now, this is interesting from a literary and logic standpoint, that Enkidu was dead by the time Gilgamesh went to see Utnapishtim. But because he's in the netherworld, he's in this human-divine interface, he has knowledge of what went on. He's no longer corporeal. Gilgamesh can't touch him, but he has knowledge. He knows that Gilgamesh and Utnapishtim had a conversation. "He gave me a plant he knew that I would lose. He gave you the wisdom of your soul." Gilgamesh stood still in the darkness, conscious of the silence once again, and of the shadows which had held for years the absence of his friend, as if just drawn from recollection back to life. So to interrupt our text for a moment, what we learn here, parenthetically, is that a long period of time has passed from the time that Enkidu has died. Gilgamesh, after years, wants to go back and try to find his friend. And of course, this is a common human experience of mourning. You miss the person who's gone, and then that yearning can come over you many, many years later, and you want to contact them. The noises in his city and of the shadow which had held for years the absence of his friend, as if just drawn from recollection back to life. So again, hearkening back over years. And now Gilgamesh confronts reality anew. The noises in his city and laughter from outside had reached his ears. Or was it just another dream, or Ea's further tricks of grace? No matter which, he went outside to see himself just what had drawn them into celebration. So this is the way this tablet closes. Gilgamesh contacts Enkidu. Enkidu, living in the shadowy netherworld, which we might compare to the Greek Hades, cannot be touched, but he can communicate. Gilgamesh, understanding that his friend is truly dead and cannot be brought back into the world of the living, now becomes aware again of the noises of the city. And we are supposed to be reminded of the end of the previous tablet, where Gilgamesh and Urshanabi return to Uruk and see the fortifications, and see how human activity can be immortal. It can be immortalized in stone. He went outside to see himself just what had drawn them, that is, the people of the city, into celebration. So again, we have a return to life in the city with its noise and bustle. Life goes on despite death. Now, throughout this series, I have endeavored to tie the themes of ancient Near Eastern mythology to biblical material, and we've spoken about many controversies about the relationship between this material and the material in the Bible. This would seem to be, in many ways, a different message than the Bible delivers about death. But I would like to focus on an early biblical idea, which scholars have emphasized in recent decades, that this bears resemblance to, and that is the idea of Sheol, S-H-E-O-L, in English translation or transliteration. In the early parts of the Bible, all we know of death is that after death, humans go to a murky place called Sheol. It is a place without reward or punishment. It is a place in which there are literally shades of people. They don't have a corporeal existence, but they can be contacted. And one example of this is the story of Samuel and King Saul in the Bible. Samuel, a great prophet, has died. King Saul, a king with many flaws like Gilgamesh, wants to contact him. He is able to contact him only by going into the world of the shades. He has communication with him. He, King Saul, realizes that Samuel is dead, but he is not able to bring him back to life to advise him. So with that biblical comparison, I'd like to close this second half of our lecture about the Epic of Gilgamesh. We have reviewed its major themes, the idea of friendship, the idea of loss, the idea that the search for immortality is futile, and the idea, finally, that the human way to make one's peace with death is through the realization that human activity can create something that will last beyond you. And it is only through this that humans can find peace. In our next lecture, we will study tales of death, destruction, and disruption, tales from Egypt and Mesopotamia.